Bates is the name, Joseph Bates, and I'm here to tell you how I went from being a ship's cabin boy to being the apostle of the seventh-day Sabbath. I was born August 7, 1792. I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which was the whaling capital of the world. I grew up dreaming of going to sea. All I talked about as a boy, I wanted to go to sea, but my parents resisted giving me permission to go to the sea, but I persisted and persisted. Finally, when I was 15 years old, they allowed me to be cabin boy on the good ship Fanny that was sailing to London. I was thrilled. When we returned from London, bound for New Bedford, the weather was wonderful. One day, one of the sailors noticed that a shark was following the ship. The ship was on the port side of the ship. Now, if you know what the port side means, well, as you are facing forward to the bow of the ship, the left side is the port side. And when a ship docks, it docks on the port side. So one of these sailors saw this shark that seemed to be trailing on the port side of the ship. So he got a big hook, baited it with a big chunk of meat, threw it overboard to see if he could catch that shark. Now, sailors are very superstitious. They believe that if a shark is following a ship, it's a bad omen. Maybe somebody is going to be dead on the ship and be buried at sea, or somebody's going to fall overboard and drown in the sea. So all day that shark was following the ship. Late in the afternoon, the captain ordered me to go up on the crow's nest of the main mast and look out and see if there were any ships in sight. So I climbed up to the crow's nest. I peered all around. I didn't see any ships, so the captain ordered me to come back down on the deck. And as I was climbing down the spar, about 50 feet above the deck, the ship lurched, and I fell backwards over the side of the ship. I fell way down deep in the water. I panicked. I swam as fast as I could to get back up above my head above water. When I got back to the surface, the ship was sailing away from me, but the captain had seen me go overboard, and so he went to the stern of the ship and he threw a rope to me. And I grabbed hold of that rope and I held onto that rope for dear life. Finally, I was pulled up on deck, and as I was gasping for breath on the deck, one of the sailors shouted, "Where was the shark?" And they looked on the port side, and the shark was not there. That shark switched to the starboard side of the ship, probably just before I fell into the ocean. And I knew then that God had spared my life. And I was thankful for that. God has been good to me. I have believed through my life that He was with me, and I've strived to always do God's will. And He kept me safe. In the spring of 1809, I was on board a ship that was struck an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland, and I and another sailor were trapped down in the hold of the ship when that iceberg struck, or we struck the iceberg, and we feared for our lives. We hung on to each other, and we prayed, and I'll never forget how God spared my life again and got me out of that hold just in the nick of time. And age 18, I was in London seeking to get on board a ship in some capacity and sail back to New Bedford. And there I was in London when suddenly a press gang shanghaied me. They impressed me into the British Navy. I had no choice, and so I became a British seaman. I tried to escape from that ship several times. Once, when I saw the shore was about 3 miles away, I put my shoes around my neck, I jumped overboard, and I was going to escape that ship and swim to shore. But somebody spotted me when I went overboard. They sent a boat after me. They hauled me into that boat, brought me back up on deck, and the captain of the ship bellowed at me, "Just who are you?" "Captain, I am an American." And he said, "Don't you know that you disobeyed me and I could have you shot for that?" He put me in solitary confinement for 30 hours. And then he had me transferred to a British warship, the Swift Shore, that was going to sail for 3 years before it got back to its port. And you know, I tried to escape from that ship too. I just didn't like being in the British Navy. Well, when I and another guy tried to cut a hole in the side of the ship so we could escape, we had the hole cut, but before we got out that hole, I was discovered. They grabbed me, and this time they sent me to the Dartmoor prison near London. Now, through many years, Dartmoor has been infamous for its cruelty. So now I was confined in Dartmoor. I had to sleep on a hard floor, no mattress, no bed, and a very thin blanket. I thought, I'm going to die here. But finally, in 1815, a treaty was signed between the United States and Britain, and I was set free. So, that was 5 years I was there in the British Navy. I finally arrived back home at New Bedford. And when I came home, my father looked me squarely in the eye and he said, "Well, Joseph, have you had enough of the sea by now?" "Father, I don't know anything else to do. I don't have any other skills or trades. All I know is how to be a sailor, and so I'm going back to sea." 1860 found me as a first mate on the brig Criterion. It was a long voyage. And when I finally returned to New Bedford, well, the family at home had a big homecoming for me. We talked until past midnight. There was a young lady there by the name of Prudence Nye. I walked Prudence home. And when I got to her gate, I took both of her hands in mine, and I said, "Prudence, you're the only girl I've ever loved. Will you marry me?" She looked up at me and said, "Joseph, you're the only man I've ever loved, and I would love to be your wife, but I have a question. Are you going to always go to sea?" I thought a moment and I said, "Prudence, I want to go to sea long enough to earn my fortune so that you and I will never be in need of money again." "Well, Joseph, how much money do you need?" "Well, Prudence, I've calculated that if I can accumulate $10,000, and then $10,000 in that time would be equal to many hundreds of thousands of dollars today. When I get $10,000, I'll leave the sea." And so we had the agreement that I would go to sea just long enough to earn the $10,000. We married. Prudence stayed in New Bedford while I sailed the 7 seas. Finally, I retired. Not with $10,000, I had $11,000, which was better. And when I retired and set up a permanent home with Prudence, well, what she did was she led me to Christ. Oh, I had believed in God, I had prayed to God, but I really wasn't a faithful, practicing Christian. But Prudence led me to Christ. And I wondered, what church should I join? My parents belonged to the Congregational Church. Prudence belonged to the Church of Christ. So I began looking at the belief system of each church, and I determined that the Congregational Church baptized by sprinkling, while the Church of Christ followed the biblical mode of baptism by immersion. So I chose to become a member of the Church of Christ, and I was baptized by immersion into that congregation. As a new Christian, I began to study the Bible in great earnest. I studied and studied. You know, I learned that the signs of the second coming, I learned what they were going to be, including the falling of the stars. And I remember November 13, 1833, Prudence and I looked up at the sky that night, and there were stars shooting through the sky. And I thought, this is another sign that Christ is going to come soon. That's predicted in Matthew 24, Christ himself. Now, around that time, a friend of mine invited me to come to a very special lecture. This lecture was going to be about the second coming of Christ, and the meeting was going to be held by a man by the name of William Miller. William Miller had studied the scriptures, and he began his sermon that night from Daniel 8:14, "Unto 2,300 days or years shall the sanctuary be cleansed." And from his studies, William Miller became convinced that Jesus Christ was going to return around October 22, 1844. I believe that with all my heart. And I became a crusader. I began to preach, like Miller, that Jesus was going to return on October 22, 1844. Now remember, I had accumulated that $11,000, and with that $11,000 that was supposed to be our life savings, I now began to use that money to preach the gospel that Jesus Christ was coming back October 22, 1844. And as our money was going and going, Prudence became worried, and she said, "Joseph, what are we going to do? You're going through this $11,000. What are we going to do?" And I said, "Prudence, that's the wonderful thing about this. We're not going to need that $11,000. When Jesus comes, we might as well not have $11,000 that would just be burned up." She held her peace, and I continued preaching. October 22, 1844. I remember when Thursday, October 21 came, and I thought to myself, tomorrow Jesus is coming. The next day, Prudence and I woke up at dawn. We went outside and were watching the sky. We expected to see a big cloud of angels bringing Jesus to this earth. We watched through the morning. There was no cloud. We watched all afternoon. There was no cloud. We watched into the darkness of night, and there was no cloud. And we wept, and we wept, and we wept, because when October 22, 1844 came and passed and the Lord had not come, why, that is known as the great disappointment. Prudence and I were very disappointed. But I continued preaching. In fact, I had in those days, a favorite hymn. That hymn still stirs my heart. I'm a pilgrim and I'm a stranger. I can tarry but a night. Do not detain me, for I am going to where the fountains are ever flowing. I'm a pilgrim and I'm a stranger. I can tarry but a night. And so I continued to preach. I didn't know exactly what I was preaching about. And then one day, it was March 1845, I got a hold of a tract. This religious tract was written by a man by the name of T.M. Preble. And in his tract, Preble maintained that all Christians should be keeping the seventh day, not the first day of the week, but the seventh day of the week, because the seventh day of the week was the true Bible Sabbath. I wondered about that, so I began to search my Bible. And the more I searched, the more I was convinced that the seventh day is truly the only Sabbath for Christians. And when I began keeping the seventh day Sabbath, I soon became known as the apostle of the Sabbath. Soon after I became a seventh-day Sabbath keeper, I heard that in Washington, New Hampshire, there was a small church that was keeping the seventh day. So I got on the train. I traveled to Washington, New Hampshire. I was directed to the home of Elder Frederick Wheeler, pastor of the Washington, New Hampshire church. I arrived at his house at 10 o'clock at night. The house was dark, but I wasn't going to wait. I began pounding on that door until finally Frederick Wheeler himself came to the door. And I said to him, I understand that you are a keeper of the seventh day. I'm Joseph Bates from New Bedford, and I've come to hear your message about the Sabbath. And Wheeler said, that's right. I've been keeping the seventh day Sabbath for about a year now. He invited me in. Now remember, it was 10 o'clock at night. We talked all night long. And by dawn, I was convinced that the seventh day was the Sabbath, and I became the apostle of the seventh-day Sabbath. When I arrived back home in New Bedford, got off the train, I was met by a friend who called out to me, Elder Bates, or Captain Bates, what is the news you have? And I responded joyfully, the good news is the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. And I began to preach the seventh day as the Sabbath. Now, initially, as I was preaching the seventh-day Sabbath, I was sad for one thing. Prudence refused to keep the seventh day with me. She maintained that the seventh-day Sabbath was for the Jews. The first-day Sabbath was for Christians. And for 4 more years, I preached the seventh-day Sabbath, and I was so happy. I was thrilled when after 4 years, Prudence began to keep the seventh day with me, and we continued to keep the seventh-day Sabbath together for the next 20 years. There was a problem. I was in my study one day, writing, and Prudence came into my study and said, Joseph, I don't have enough flour to finish baking bread. Would you please go to the market and buy some flour for me. Well, Prudence, how many pounds of flour do you need? Well, I need about 4 pounds. So I went to the market. I bought 4 pounds of flour, brought it back home, put it on the kitchen counter, and went back to my study. And shortly, Prudence was at my door, and she said, Joseph, what is this? She was holding the flour. And I said, well, you said you needed 4 pounds of flour, so I bought 4 pounds of flour. And Prudence said, what? Captain Bates that sailed the 7 seas came back a rich man, goes to the market and only buys 4 pounds of flour? And I said, yes, Prudence, I bought only 4 pounds of flour, and I might as well tell you, I used the very last cent that I have to buy the 4 pounds of flour. She began to weep and said, Joseph, whatever are we going to do? I said, Prudence, the Lord has always provided for us, and He will provide for us now. I said, I'm impressed. God is impressing me to go to the post office to see if we have any mail. When I got to the post office, the postmaster said, yes, Mr. Bates, you have a letter, but there's postage due on the letter. And I said, but I don't have a single cent. Well, until you pay the postage due, you aren't going to have the letter. So I said to the postmaster, I tell you what, you open the letter, and if there's money inside, you deduct the amount from that money that's inside the letter for the postage and give me the rest. So the postmaster opened the letter, and there was a $10 bill. It came from somebody I didn't know. But the person that sent it said in his letter, Captain Bates, the Lord has impressed me to send you this money, so I'm sending it. Never did learn who sent the money. But I took what was left after the postage was paid. I went by the market. I ordered a whole barrel, not 4 pounds, a whole barrel of flour, along with potatoes and other vegetables and other foods. And I said to the shopkeeper, I want you to deliver these food items and the barrel of flour to my house. Now, when you deliver it, Prudence is probably going to try to tell you that it isn't ours, but you leave it anyway. And when I got home, Prudence came to me in amazement. Joseph, where did all these groceries come from? I showed her the letter. And she exclaimed, why don't I learn to trust the Lord more? August 1846. I engaged a printer to print my book entitled The Seventh-day Sabbath, A Perpetual Sign. I paid down on that book printing all the money I had. And when the printer said to me, the books are ready, I went to his print shop and I said, I don't know what to do. The books are ready, but I don't have any more money. And the printer said, well, Elder Bates, your books have all been paid for. Well, who paid for them? And the print man said, well, I don't know. A man came in and paid for all the books. He was a stranger. I didn't recognize him, and he didn't give me his name. And you know, I never learned who it was that paid for the books, 1,000 copies, the seventh-day Sabbath, a perpetual sign. And I was now the apostle of the seventh day. Early in 1846, I met two interesting people, James White and Ellen Harmon. This was before they were married. But they were holding meetings in all places right there in my hometown of New Bedford. So I went to the meetings. And James preached a very exhortation type of sermon. But then Ellen Harmon began to tell about things that she had seen in vision. Visions, that seemed very, very strange to me. Now, many people believed that Ellen White had visions, but I didn't. I spoke up right there and I said, I am a doubting Thomas. I do not believe that Ellen Harmon's so-called visions are from God. If I did become convinced they were from God, I would be the happiest man. But I don't believe they're from God. I believe she's sincere, but I don't believe her. Now, I then presented my book, The Seventh Day, a Perpetual Sign, to them. But I was amazed. James and Ellen White were not ready to accept the fact that the seventh day was the Sabbath. We were at a standoff. I didn't believe her visions, and she didn't believe the seventh day was the Sabbath. By August 1846, Ellen White were back in New Bedford, and they had been married by this time. And when I reminded them of the book, this time they read the book. And I was overjoyed when James and Ellen White began keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. But I still had a big question in my mind as to whether Ellen White's visions were really from God. And then one night in Topsham, Maine, and I'll never forget, it was in 1846 in Topsham, Maine, I was there when Ellen White had a vision. And in this vision, she graphically described the starry heavens. And as she was describing the starry heavens, she began to talk about the constellation Orion. That constellation is called the Hunter. And from the belt of the Hunter in this constellation hangs a sword. The sword in the constellation is of 3 stars. The middle star is not really a star. It's an aurora. It's a big opening in the sky, as though through that opening a brilliant light is shining through. Ellen White even said that the holy city is going to come down through that middle star of the belt of Orion. And this suddenly made sense to me. I remembered back when the stars fell that night, November 13, 1833. The stars seemed to be falling from a focal point. That shower of stars that seemed to be coming through out of the middle star of Orion. The middle star, the sword of Orion. And I thought to myself, a sword, a sword. When Christ comes the second time, he is going to be holding a sickle. And all a sickle is a sword that has been heated and curved into the shape of a sickle. And that's the message God was giving November 13, 1833, when the stars fell from heaven. When Ellen White's vision was over, I said to her, "Where did you ever study astronomy?" And Ellen replied, I have never studied astronomy. And when she said that, I then became convinced that her visions had to be from God. And now the Whites and myself began presenting the Sabbath. We traveled together in a two-seated wagon. James and Ellen sat in the front seat. I was seated in the second seat, right behind them. They had a horse that was an interesting horse. Actually, it was a colt. And they had been warned when they got that colt, be very careful. Don't put your hand on the flank of the horse. Don't let the reins touch the flank of the horse, because if you do, he's going to kick viciously. And by the way, they were warned that they should always drive that horse with the tightly held rein, because otherwise he might run away. And when he ran away once, 2 men were killed in that runaway accident involving that horse. So there we traveled, James and Ellen in the front seat, I right behind. And as we traveled, all of a sudden, Ellen White exclaimed in a beautiful voice, "Glory, glory, glory." Now, my Seventh Adventist fellow pioneer, John Lefbrough, who witnessed Ellen White in vision more than 50 times, said that many times her vision would begin with her crying out 3 times, "Glory." Lefbrough even told me that, like the prophet Daniel, when Ellen White was in vision, she did not breathe. So on this occasion, when she called out "Glory," the horse stopped still. And while she was in that vision, she got out of the wagon. As she got out, she placed her hand on the flank of that horse. And I shouted, "James, that colt will kick her to death." And James very calmly replied, "The Lord is in charge of that colt now, and I will not interfere." For several minutes, Ellen White stood there with her hand on the flank of that horse. That horse stood stock still. She rested her hand more heavily on it as she climbed back into the wagon. And as soon as she was seated, without a word from James, the colt started on down the road. In 1851, another event occurred. I met the Smith family in Wilton, New Hampshire. Now, Mrs. Rebecca Smith was a firm believer in the Advent message as preached by William Miller. She had children, 2, a boy by the name of Uriah and a daughter by the name of Annie. They went through that great disappointment too. And when the disappointment was over, they no longer believed in the soon coming of Jesus Christ. Uriah and Annie decided they would resume their education he went to the prestigious Phillips Academy, and Annie went to the New England Seminary. And when they graduated, they both went to teach at Phillips Academy. And you know, that first year as they taught at Phillips Academy, they were paid the magnificent sum of $1,000 a year plus room and board. I was scheduled to preach in a church near them. But before I got to that church to preach, I had a remarkable dream. And in my dream, I intended to preach the 2,300 days. But then, just about the time we were singing the last stanza of the last hymn, the door at the rear of the church opened up, and in came a young lady and took the only seat left, which was right by that back door. And in my dream, I knew she was Annie Smith. Now, the interesting thing was, the same night that I had my dream, Annie Smith had a dream in which she went to a church to attend a meeting When she went through the door into the sanctuary, there was only one seat left, and it was by the back door. And as she sat down, a man stood up to preach. And in her dream, she recognized the man that was to preach as Joseph Smith. And lo and behold, that is the way it actually happened. I went to that church. We were singing the opening hymn. The door opened, and in came Annie Smith. I recognized her. She recognized me. And I switched my topic that had been announced from the 1844 prophecy. I switched and preached on the seventh-day Sabbath. And I was thrilled. Annie went back to her home. She shared with her mother. She shared with her brother that the seventh day is the Sabbath. They began to keep the seventh day. Uriah Smith went on to become the editor of the church paper, the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. Today, for some reason, they've shortened it. Today, when you get your periodic in the mail, it just says Review. We're no longer keeping that old title, and I prefer the old title. So Uriah was the editor of the Review, and Annie was a poetess, and she wrote a poem. In fact, you sang it during the song service today, I Saw One Weary. And the first stanza is about me. And the second stanza is about James White. And the third stanza, even though it is in the masculine form, we believe now that the third stanza refers to Annie Smith. You know, Annie Smith had a great disappointment. In addition to the great disappointment of 1844, she had a disappointment because she was in love with John Nevins Andrews. And she thought they would be married, but they weren't. Andrews went on to be the first Seventh-day Adventist missionary to go to another country. He went to Europe, went to Switzerland. Annie was left behind, and she passed away. Time went on. I always believed that the Lord was leading me, the Lord was guiding me, and again, I became known as the apostle of the seventh-day Sabbath. God guided me to go to Battle Creek. Now, at that time, when I was guided to Battle Creek, the main headquarters the Adventist Church had was in Rochester, New York. That's where the printing press was that printed the Review. But God directed me to Battle Creek, Michigan. And as I was on the train going to Battle Creek, God impressed me that when I got to Battle Creek, I should find out who the most honest man in town was. Got there early in the morning, got off the train, went to the post office. It had just opened up, and I said to the postmaster, "Can you direct me to the most honest man in Battle Creek?" And he said, "I surely can. His name, yes. His name is David Hewitt. He lives on Van Buren Street." And a few minutes later, I was knocking on Hewitt's door. You know, Joseph Bates, as the apostle of the Sabbath, knocked on a good many doors. So he was early in the morning knocking on Hewitt's door. Hewitt came to the door to welcome him. And I said, "Mr. Hewitt, I've been told that you're the most honest man in town, and I have a very special message for you." Well, Brother Hewitt said to me, "We're just having breakfast. Come in and eat with us, and when breakfast is over and we have our family worship, you can tell us the message that you have for us. Now, while we were eating, Hewitt was sizing me up, and he decided that I was an honest man also. And so we studied all day. I had a chart explaining the seventh-day Sabbath that I used every time I preached on it. I hung that up, and I guided them through that. We studied together all day. And by evening, the most honest man in town, David Hewitt, and his family all became seventh-day Sabbath keepers. As you know, I'm known as the apostle of the seventh-day Sabbath. You can go to Oak Hill Cemetery on the outskirts of Battle Creek, Michigan. Right after you enter that cemetery, on the left is a plot of ground where the White family are buried. There's James White buried there, Ellen White buried there. The headstones of their children are there. You go past that, and further down the lane, you can come to a grave marker, a large one that proclaims David Hewitt, the most honest man in Battle Creek. You need to go there and see it for yourself. So I returned from Battle Creek to New Bedford, and I said, Prudence, I have founded a church in Battle Creek, and I want us to move there. And Prudence, who was always a cautious person, said, Joseph, are you telling me that after making New Bedford your home for 60 years, you're going to move all the way to Battle Creek? And I said, yes, because I believe God is calling me there. So we moved to Battle Creek. And Prudence said when we were settled down, now, Joseph, maybe it's time that you settle down and we can spend our remaining years together. But I said, Prudence, I just can't sit and do nothing. I've got to do something. I can't remain inactive while there's a great work still to do for the Lord. You know, a while before that, somebody said to James White, don't you think it's time that Joseph Bates retired? And James White thought for a minute, and he said, you know, it's better to wear out than to rust out. And I think that's the motto of my life. So I traveled all over Michigan. I traveled around Wisconsin. I raised up Seventh-day Sabbath-keeping churches in many, many places. Finally, I held meetings in Bucksbridge, New York. Bucksbridge, New York was the home of a man by the name of John Byington. John Byington was a Wesleyan Methodist preacher. I came to John Byington. I showed him that the seventh day was the Sabbath, and I was thrilled again. John Byington began to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, and 10 years later, John Byington was elected the first president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. I brought the Sabbath first to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Prudence and I lived another 13 years in Battle Creek. I was there when the Seventh-day Adventist Church was organized. Seventh day. I was the one that brought that day to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I became the first president of the Michigan Conference in 1861. When the church was organized in 1863, I could have been elected to a General Conference position, but I felt that God had another work for me to do. You know, for years and years, I lived a temperate life. I abstained from tobacco, I abstained from alcohol, and I was a vegetarian for a good many years. I was a vegetarian before Seventh-day Adventists became known as vegetarians. And I believe being a vegetarian was healthy for me. I witnessed some significant Seventh-day Adventist ministers, James White, Uriah Smith, John Loughborough, Elliot Wagner, John Andrews, and many others suffering from various physical afflictions. But not I. I worked year in and year out. I worked in summer heat, and I worked in winter cold with nary an ache or pain in my body. Early in 1870, I was busy preaching when Prudence sent me a message. Joseph, I want to have my mind free from care and household duties, that I might give my time to be right with the Lord. In retrospect, I conclude that Prudence was having a premonition. I quickly went home to Prudence. On August 17, she was stricken with a very high fever that lasted for several days, 10 days. And I tenderly watched over her. When she opened her eyes, Prudence knew I was torn between staying with her or returning to where I was having meetings. She waved a feeble hand at me and said, Joseph, go to your meetings. It is God's will. Somewhat reluctantly, but also somewhat relieved, I went back and I finished the meetings. When the meetings were over, I rushed home, arrived there Friday. We kept the seventh-day Sabbath together. And then at sunset, as the close of the Sabbath came, my beloved wife, Prudence, closed her eyes and slept in death. And of course I missed her. But I'll tell you one thing. I did not grieve as do others who have no hope. I have in my heart the blessed hope that when Jesus comes, the dead in Christ shall rise, and we're caught up together to be with the Lord forever. I'm not only the apostle of the Sabbath, I'm the apostle of the blessed hope. I'm growing older now. Someone has suggested that I retire. And I answer this. When a workhorse grows too old to pull the plow, that old horse does not like to remain alone in the stable while the younger horses go out to plow. And so many times the farmer would allow the old horse to walk alongside of the plowing horses. So now in my senior years, let me at least walk alongside of the younger ministers. And I did. I closed my last report to the General Conference with this prayer. O Lord, in Jesus' dear name, help us, this very dear people, to fulfill your sacred promise. Joseph Bates passed to his rest March 9, 1872 in Battle Creek, Michigan. And that's how he went from being a ship's cabin boy to the apostle of the Sabbath. On his burial monument is this Bible verse, he, being dead, yet speaketh. No scripture could be more appropriate for Joseph Bates, who went from cabin boy to the apostle of the Seventh-day Sabbath.